He was a successful businessman, a respected community member, a man who entertained children at birthday parties. He called himself Pogo the Clown, but behind the painted smile was something else, something darker, something no one saw coming. How does a man who shakes hands with politicians end up hiding secrets no one would believe? How does someone lead two lives, one filled with charm and public applause, and another built on silence, deception, and psychological collapse? This is not the story of a monster. It's the story of a man whose mind slowly unraveled, a man whose darkness grew, not all at once but quietly over time. This video is not about the crimes. It's not about the details the news repeated again and again. This is about the why, the invisible path from childhood confusion to emotional numbness to internal breakdown. Because sometimes what breaks a person is not anger, not even hate. Sometimes it's silence, it's pain that no one ever sees. Let's begin. Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy was responsible for a series of crimes that shocked the United States. He lived in Norwood Park, a quiet suburb of Chicago. To his neighbors, he seemed like a normal man. He ran a construction business. He threw block parties. He even dressed up as a clown to entertain children. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Over those 6 years, young men and boys began disappearing. Many of them were never seen again. The pattern was quiet, but it grew. One by one, families reported missing sons, runaways the police assumed, troubled teens, misunderstood youth. It wasn't until 1978 that the truth began to unravel. A routine missing person case led police to Gacy's home. What they found there would stun the country. In the weeks that followed, John Wayne Gacy confessed. He was ultimately convicted of 33 murders. The majority of the victims were buried beneath his home. Others were found nearby, discarded in rivers. The news coverage focused on horror, on numbers, on the shock of it all. But today we won't focus on that, because what matters for us is understanding how a person reaches that point. What emotional void, what mental spiral leads someone to build a double life? That's the question we explore next. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the second of 3 children in a working-class family. His father was a World War I veteran and a strict, often angry man. His mother was more nurturing, quiet, protective, but often powerless in the home. From the outside, the Gacy household looked like many others, but inside it was a place of fear and control. Gacy's father drank heavily. He belittled his son. He called him weak. He questioned his masculinity. And he sometimes hit him with his fists or with a belt. As a child, Gacy struggled to find approval. He tried to please his father. He worked hard in school. He joined clubs, but nothing seemed to be enough. Despite the turmoil at home, he managed to build a life that appeared normal. He got engaged, he married, he had children, he ran a small business, he became active in local politics. In public, Gacy was confident, sociable, charming. He networked with community leaders. He took photos with mayors. He even posed with the First Lady of the United States. But beneath that polished image, something inside him remained unresolved, something from the past, something that had never been healed. His smile hid the fractures. His success covered the scars, and no one was looking close enough to see what was coming next. To understand John Wayne Gacy's transformation, we have to go back to the earliest years of his life. Because the roots of violence often begin in silence, in moments no one remembers, or in wounds no one treats. Gacy's childhood was defined by emotional instability. His father, a mechanic and war veteran, believed in discipline through fear. He often called his son names stupid, soft, sometimes worse. There were beatings and long stretches of cold disapproval. Even when Gacy tried his best, he was told he wasn't enough. As a boy, he developed health issues, fainting spells, blackouts, hospital visits, but his father dismissed them. He accused John of faking it for attention. This rejection, the constant invalidation, left deep marks, not on the body, but on the mind. He began to doubt himself, to hide his feelings, to live behind masks, long before the clown costume ever came. There was another layer, too. As he entered adolescence, Gacy struggled with questions about identity, confusion, isolation, feelings he could not share, not in his home, not in his community. He began leading a double emotional life. Outwardly, he tried to fit in, but inwardly, he carried shame, resentment, and fear. According to some experts, early trauma like this can shape personality disorders. It can stunt emotional development. It can lead to a disconnect between empathy and action. Dr. Karen Fields, a clinical psychologist, notes, children who experience chronic emotional rejection may suppress their emotions to survive. Over time, this can manifest as detachment from the feelings of others, especially if the child never learns safe emotional expression. In Gacy's case, the pattern fits: suppressed anger, hidden confusion, no safe outlet, and no one who truly listened. These weren't just personality quirks, they were warnings, and they were missed. No one becomes who they are in a single moment. Change happens slowly, sometimes silently, and often it's shaped by pain that never fully goes away. For John Wayne, Gacy adulthood brought opportunities but also pressure and failure. In the 1960s, Gacy moved to Iowa. He managed a fast food franchise, started a family, and seemed to settle into normal life. But underneath his struggles continued. He still longed for validation. He still feared rejection. He still carried the invisible wounds of childhood. And then cracks began to show. He was arrested for inappropriate behavior with teenage boys. He denied it. But the evidence was strong. He was convicted in 1968 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was a turning point. His wife divorced him. He lost his job. His public image collapsed. He served only 18 months. But something inside had shifted. Prison didn't rehabilitate him. It hardened him. And it taught him something dangerous: how to pretend, how to hide, how to become someone people trusted even while living a lie. When he got out, he rebuilt his life. New town, new business, new image. But the emotional cracks had only deepened. The rejection stung. The failure haunted him. And the shame, it grew in silence. According to forensic psychiatrist Dr. Alan Brooks, when people with narcissistic traits experience public failure or humiliation, it can trigger an intense identity crisis. They either collapse inward or create a stronger mask. Often the mask becomes the only version they allow others to see. That's exactly what Gacy did. He became the mask, the successful contractor, the neighborhood clown, the man who everyone liked, but inside something darker had taken root. Resentment, frustration, control, and the need to never feel powerless again. This was the psychological pivot, not a sudden snap, but a slow spiral. And from that spiral there would be no return. It didn't happen with a scream, or a breakdown in the street. There was no outburst, no visible crisis. John Wayne Gacy unraveled quietly. By the mid-1970s, he had created two completely separate identities. By day, he was a businessman working long hours building a reputation. He shook hands with city leaders. He was photographed with community icons. He even called himself the clown, a man who made people laugh. But at night, that's when the mask slipped, not publicly, but internally. There are reports from those close to him times when his mood would suddenly darken, when he'd disappear for hours, when his tone would change. Behind closed doors, he was no longer trying to impress anyone. He was slipping into something colder, more detached. And at some point, he stopped pretending even to himself. Psychologist Dr. Rachel Meyer explains, when someone creates a split between their public self and private self, they often reach a breaking point where one identity completely overtakes the other. It's not a sudden change. It's a slow erosion of boundaries. For Gacy, that erosion became total. He stopped seeing people as people. He started seeing them as threats to his control, or as tools to feed his illusion of power. He once described feeling like the world owed him something, that people had taken advantage of him, that he had the right to take something back. It was a dangerous shift from wounded child to entitled predator. One former employee recalled Gacy standing in his office alone, just staring, expressionless, silent, not angry, not sad, just hollow. That was the moment, not an explosion, but an absence. He didn't cry, he didn't rage. He simply disappeared behind his own eyes. What remained was not emotion, not empathy, not guilt, only control and silence. Before a crime is committed, there is a storm, not on the outside, but inside the mind. In the years before his arrest, John Wayne Gacy operated beneath a layer of intense psychological control, not just over others, but over himself. He was calculated, organized, disciplined in the most chilling way. He rationalized his thoughts. He justified his behavior. He told himself stories about power, about dominance, about what he deserved. This is what psychologists call cognitive distortion. When someone rewrites reality to suit their inner needs, they don't see cruelty. They see strategy. They don't feel guilt. They feel entitlement. According to Dr. Stephen Larson, a forensic psychologist, people like Gacy often convince themselves that their victims are beneath them or that they are simply acting out roles that society has already pushed them into. It becomes a self-serving cycle. Gacy's mind was full of these distortions. He believed he was smarter than everyone else. He thought he could outmaneuver the police. He believed he was in complete control. But there was something else, a growing emotional numbness. Former friends said he became distant, harder to talk to. He no longer showed warmth or affection, even with people close to him. Instead, he compartmentalized. He separated his actions from his identity. In his mind, he could be both the friendly neighbor and the hidden predator. And it worked for a while, because Gacy didn't commit crimes in chaos. He committed them in structure, in patterns, in control. He wasn't out of control. He was disconnected from empathy, from humanity, from himself. And that disconnection was the final barrier that allowed him to cross a line most never would. What happens after the line is crossed? For most people, committing a terrible act would trigger guilt, shame, remorse. But John Wayne Gacy didn't show any of that. After his crimes, he went back to work. He laughed with customers. He met city officials. He handed out business cards. He entertained children at hospitals. There were no outward signs of distress, no breakdowns, no confessions, only silence. This is where Gacy's psychology becomes even more disturbing. Because he didn't panic, he planned. He didn't hide in fear, he blended in. He kept trophies. He covered his tracks. And when suspicions started to form, he acted innocent, calm, even helpful. Dr. Marissa Holloway, a criminal behavior expert, explains, this level of post-crime detachment is not about mental instability. It's about extreme compartmentalization. The offender has created such a strong divide in their mind that they don't experience reality the same way most people do. When police finally began investigating Gacy seriously, he didn't resist. He smiled. He answered questions. He joked with detectives. Even after his arrest, he maintained his innocence for a time. And when he did confess, it wasn't a breakdown. It was almost casual, like he was finally done pretending, but not apologizing. He blamed others. He blamed the system. He even claimed he had done some of it in a kind of trance, a fog. But the truth is, he knew what he was doing, and he had known it for years. There was no mental collapse in the way most people imagine. There was only an emotional void. And inside that void, he felt nothing. Not empathy, not guilt, not even fear. Only control, and the illusion that he had never really done anything wrong. John Wayne Gacy's story is tragic, not only because of what happened, but because of what was missed. There were signs, early ones, subtle ones, but signs nonetheless. A troubled childhood marked by emotional abuse. Adolescence filled with confusion and self-doubt. Early adult behaviors that revealed boundary issues, manipulation, and denial. There were opportunities for intervention. Moments when someone could have asked deeper questions. Moments when mental health support might have changed the course. But no one did. Or if they did, it wasn't enough. Gacy's case reminds us that crimes like his don't appear out of nowhere. They begin in silence, in suppressed emotions, in untreated trauma, in lives that fall through the cracks. So what can we as a society learn? First, early emotional support matters. Children who grow up in homes filled with fear, rejection, or confusion need help, not punishment, not shame. Second, we need to destigmatize mental health conversations, especially in men, especially in communities where emotional expression is seen as weakness. Third, we need to listen to the quiet ones, the angry ones, the ones who smile too much, because sometimes pain hides behind performance. Dr. Elena Myers, clinical trauma specialist, says, "When we normalize mental health check-ins the same way we do physical ones, we start catching problems early. Empathy can interrupt the cycle of silence. And finally, prevention isn't just about catching criminals. It's about building a culture where emotional distress doesn't have to turn into destruction. We may not be able to change the past, but we can change how we respond to pain, how we educate children, how we support adults in crisis. Because sometimes the difference between healing and hurting others is a single conversation." John Wayne Gacy was called many things: a monster, a sociopath, a man beyond understanding. But when we strip away the headlines, when we move past the shock, what remains is a broken person. Not broken by excuse, but broken by silence, neglect, and unresolved pain. This video has not been about justifying his actions. It's been about understanding the layers beneath them. Gacy's life reminds us of a truth we often ignore, that the roots of violence can grow in ordinary soil, that people who commit unthinkable acts sometimes start out not so different from anyone else. He was a child once, a boy with fears, a teenager searching for identity, an adult craving control in a world he couldn't manage. And when no one helped him navigate that inner storm, he created his own rules, his own world. And in doing so, he caused unimaginable harm. But if there's a purpose in retelling this story, it's this: listen, look closer. Support those in emotional pain before they disappear behind their own eyes. Because sometimes the worst crimes don't begin with hate. They begin with disconnection, with fear, with silence. And sometimes the smallest act of empathy can stop that silence from growing. If this video moved, you share it. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more content that explores the psychology behind human behavior. Because the more we understand, the more we can prevent, and maybe the more we can heal.